Hello and welcome back. We are live from Jagex HQ and I'm joined by mods Sponge and Jack. And today we're going to be talking about the economy and death costs.
Hey, I'm Mod Sponge, aka Brad, on the Combat Council, content developer, been with Jagex for about 4 or so years. It's kind of blows into one. Originally QA, now content dev, involved in a lot of combat and rewards.
You've made an impression as the rewards guy.
The rewards guy, yeah, that is now my thing, yeah, sadly. Yeah. But hey ho.
It's good to have a thing, I think.
I guess.
I'm Mod Jack. As of recently, I'm the lead designer. Are we doing real names and life histories? Is that how we're doing it?
Whatever you want.
How long have I been with Jagex now? 12 years, I think. And my name's Tim, which makes my mod name really confusing.
I think the first main thing we're going to talk about, and it's kind of a two-parter, is death costs, and they tie in to the economy in a lot of ways. But I think especially in the last couple of years, there's been increased discussion around death costs, sort of both as a barrier to entry for PVMing, and I think as a pain point for players across the board. And now that is something that has been looked at for a long time. And to my understanding, there are going to be changes made to death costs in the near future. So I think first question is just personal opinion. How do we feel about death costs? What do you personally think about them?
Death costs are a weird one. Obviously, you can understand the necessity for them with them tying into the economy so much, PVM generating such large amounts of money. So it's clear we need some access to money sinks. So obviously it provides that very well. And originally, they didn't exist, right? It was, you die, your stuff was on the ground or in a gravestone, and if it timed out, you lose it. So as far as I'm aware, it was introduced as a way to remove the pain of, I have to go get my stuff again, or if there was issues. You see like Araxor has the graveyard area.
Yes.
And that was cool. That was created due to issues where too many people were dying, so there was too many gravestones to the point where some would disappear.
Yes.
So it seems like, to my opinion, obviously not being with Jagex when that happened, that death costs were introduced as a way to mitigate that, so that you could just, all right, go take the easy way out, buy my stuff back.
It was almost a cost for convenience of not having to run all the way back. It wasn't meant to be like a finer balancing point. It was either run back, grab your stuff, or have the cost associated with getting everything teleported straight back to you.
And it was created in a time where people weren't necessarily carrying around 8 bills worth of items, right?
Yeah, I think with the introduction of invention and degradables and switchscape and everything else, I think just it's an old system that it didn't phase super well into the evolved evolution of combat in today's modern game.
Yeah, I feel like it definitely hasn't kept up with the rest of the game, and that's the big pain point with it. I'm not sure how Jack feels.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with all of that. It's interesting to think about it from a high level point of view, as you were talking about, like we had, effectively it was kind of random whether you lost items. It's quite important that items do leave the economy sometimes, because otherwise they essentially flood in. Now, invention corrected that, as you mentioned. But we replaced a sort of, effectively, like if there was a bug or a server problem or your connection dropped, or like your mum called you away or something, then you might lose your items. So at random, people just sort of randomly got items removed from the game. And we replaced that with what is effectively a flat punishment, and took that opportunity to add in a gold sink to address some of the gold inflation issues at the time. But it's quite interesting thinking about gold. I think where death costs have evolved and become a bit of a frustration for people is that although they are a gold sink, they're a slightly arbitrary gold sink in a way, because they're kind of tied to performance. You only suffer death costs if you die. It's not a cost to play the game, it's a cost to fail.
They become a tax on learning or trying to improve across the board at all levels.
Or again, like bugs, server issues, your connection, your mum calls you away, all the same issues now cause you to lose gold. And it's now, as you mentioned, because the system feels incorrectly balanced for the massive value of gear now, you lose a staggering amount of gold when one of those things happens.
Absolutely.
And it's annoying and frustrating for that to happen. It's like a double punishment, right? Dying is bad already. You don't need to be punished for dying. You're already punished for dying.
You're not getting compensation for, you're not getting a boss kill, you're not getting the loot.
You may have lost your consumables or whatever.
It makes more sense for money to leave the game through the players that are farming bosses for 1,000 hours straight without dying, right? That's where you want the money to leave. You don't want some guy being introduced, dying and going, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. And they've brought nothing into the game. They've just had money leave.
It's a strong barrier to entry for, I don't even think necessarily for like new people trying to get into the game, but I think it's a huge it's one of the reasons why a lot of teams won't take inexperienced people.
Absolutely.
And I think beyond that, even a step further, it's a big reason why a lot of inexperienced people don't feel comfortable going with an experienced team, because it's the
they could
constant,
cost them money.
what if
Yeah.
I mess up and I cost everyone across the team 100 million coins?
Yeah.
And that's stressful. And no, I totally agree with what Brad said. With it's kind of taxing the wrong people. And I think the people that maybe could be taxed are the people that are moving a lot of GP, a lot of actual currency. It's not the people trying to get to that point. It's the people that already have it, because on them, it's not going to make or break their gameplay experience in the same way. With relation to that, I think just a full blanket question. So could you take me through what's kind of been arranged for death costs with this update?
So the high level version of the changes we're making is essentially just reducing death costs.
Okay.
There's some specific maths. This probably isn't the right place to go through the specific maths, but the costs have got wildly out of control. So we've looked at various models of how we can reduce the cost and make it fair at different levels of play, make sure that it's not unfairly punishing any particular group, and just massively lower death costs across the board. I think that's just the good message. What we haven't done is completely remove death costs. I mean, obviously that's an option on the table. It's just death is free, as we've talked about a little bit. Like the risk and the punishment are in the wrong place.
Yes.
But if we completely remove death costs, then we remove any incentive to think about what you're doing and think about what gear you're using. So what we're doing is massively lowering them, but not removing them completely.
If you could give me like a ballpark for like an end game setup death cost, if it's a cap system or anything like that.
I think in some situations you could see anywhere near as like 10% of what you're currently paying. It very much depends on the setup you currently have.
How did you determine the setup? Is it tracked based on grand exchange value, or is it tier, or is it kind of a mix of the two? Is it a dynamic system?
It's based on GE cost still, because that way the death costs scale with inflation in the economy. But it's flat based on the total value of the gear. At the moment, I believe it scales up. We removed that because when we looked at the numbers for low-level players with the system that we've got, they were fine.
They're not too bad.
We don't. One of the proposals we discussed in some detail was like, do we make it do we make it free for low-level players, or do we have a lower threshold and upper threshold? And then when we assigned the system that we've got, we ended up like it just looks fine at both ends.
I think a big reason for that too is the system itself. It allows a series of items to be protected for free. Newer players don't have as many items with them, whether it's a SwitchScape thing or they're not getting into invention perks. And as a result of that, if you're dying with 6 items and 3 of them or 4 of them are protected for free, your death cost is very, very manageable.
What we wanted to make sure was just that the system was there for, like, you want to make sure you understand the system, right? It doesn't really mean anything at low levels of combat. It's such a trivial amount of gold that it doesn't matter, but it gets you accustomed to the idea that the system exists and helps you to understand the system.
Absolutely. Well, I think overall initial reaction to that, I think, a dramatic reduction of death costs is fantastic. I think it's a good time for this to happen in the game. I think it's been a pain point for especially the last 3 years. That's where you've started to see the rise of like a significant death cost a few years ago might have been 3 mil. And then in the last few years, it's now 10, 15, 20, 25 mil with an endgame setup. And at a certain point, it just felt like this feels uncapped and it doesn't feel right. And I think part of it too is it doesn't feel satisfying to die once and lose a whole hour of profit.
Essentially, when we looked through the existing system, what we found was that when the developers had designed the scaling system that they designed, it wasn't really written to take into account the large values now, and no one had ever adjusted them. So it's got out of control in a way that was never intended by the people who wrote the original algorithm for it.
Fantastic. No, I'm definitely glad to hear that. I know I've been like a main vocal, point in the community with relation to death costs and sort of the impact they have on learning. When you're looking at the economy and death costs and even the cost of PVM, if you want to go there as well, I think that is something where when you're assigned to make drop tables, because you are the person in charge of doing a lot of the drop tables for recent updates, you have to set a baseline amount of gold to offset costs.
Yeah, a lot goes into drop tables because you want people to do the content right. Yeah. And what way is it to get people to do the content? One, obviously, it's new and exciting. But then once they got past that, they need a reason to stay on. The drop tables need to be enticing enough where you want to do it over the last thing, but then at the same time, we don't want to essentially power creep drop tables, which has happened. You can see that happening. So you see things like Arch Glacier just shooting huge numbers of items into the game, which arguably could be seen as a problem. But at the same time, as long as we have sinks for these items and they're actually usable, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Quite recently, a couple of times I've kind of shouted out, what do you want from drop tables? What's the pain points right now? So you see things like cockatrice eggs, which were some really niche item that players were shooting through loads of, and were just kind of becoming unreasonably expensive to the point where you didn't want to use the item they created. It's very much taking players' opinions, seeing what they want, seeing what the economy wants, looking at prices, looking at price histories. You can't just throw things on because then it just leads to trouble. Obviously, in the past, I've shown some resistance to like salvages and alkaballs, but again, they are an easy and nice way to give players a consistent money that isn't going to fluctuate. You look at things like Raksha, right? And what once was a drop worth like 300k Spirit Weed Seeds, I don't know what they
it was even uppers of that on release.
Exactly. But then something like Archglacior comes along, it's like, cool,
drops a billion of them, and now
drops infinite numbers of Spirit Weed Seeds, and suddenly poor Raksha back there crying. There is some aspect of, is it fun as well if every drop I'm getting is the exact same, right? I know when I do Raksha, saying I get a big salvage drop, I'm like, ooh, I got that. But if we just gave out the exact same drop the entire time, right, I think that would quickly
if you
lose
gave
its fun.
1/10 of each item each time.
Exactly.
I think there's a lot there. But I mean, you spoke on earlier about kind of reducing the discrepancy between this drop is worth 0, this drop is worth 3 mil. And I think you've done that in recent tables you worked on. And the way that you've done that is by giving multiple drops. Carapac in a solo, you get 3 piles.
Yeah.
Or
it's a diversified portfolio.
A better idea, potentially, you could, or not a better idea, but a better example would be Croesus. You can roll, I believe, 12 times on the loot table.
Yes.
And I think is that sort of a system you implemented as a good way to kind of reduce that discrepancy?
Yes. Croesus specifically was, I believe, I designed the table, but I believe it was Mod Shogun that actually fiddled with the numbers and whatever. I just said we should have X, Y, and Z on there. And I still have some problems with it, but that's fine. I think it was more because Croesus is less intense, I'd say. And you can do your bit in AFK. They needed more of a way of rewarding players that put in a lot of effort. Obviously now that's come to players strategizing around the point system. But that was why it was like you could get up to 12 rolls, was just, I've put in loads of effort, so I should be awarded more than the guy in the corner that's AFK'd for 5 minutes. That being said, yes, it does help awarding multiple drops because your chance of getting just a single low thing is reduced. It's still there, but it balances out a bit more. So it is something that we've done for other things as well, that you'll hopefully see soon.
I think the risk is what you pointed out at the start, which is that it homogenizes the drops.
It does, yeah.
So it lowers. So and this is tricky because we're talking about player types here, right? There are some players who would definitely rather that the boss just dropped a fixed amount of raw gold every kill. Like they would love that because then they could exactly predict what they're going to get for every moment of time they spend, and calculate their exact gains and losses. And it's frustrating to them when they earn less than they expected to for that moment. There are other players for whom the fun of it is kind of inherent to the activity, right? PVM isn't like spend money, make gold. It's invest, get drop table, get random reward. That's the nature of what PVM is in this game. We could completely change that. I'm not sure that I think the number of players that treat it effectively as a guaranteed gold generator and are frustrated when it isn't a guaranteed gold generator, I don't think necessarily justifies completely changing the nature of PVM in this game.
Yeah, you can see in some drops where we've kind of tried to go the best of both worlds. You look at like the Fractured Staff of Armadillo, right? We could have just dropped that as one big drop, and have it as a 1 in, I don't know, 5,000 chance, right?
Yeah.
But instead of doing that, we split it in 3.
Yeah.
So now you're more likely to get a bit,
Yeah.
The baseline level of my GP per hour is still going to be the same because it's 3 times as common.
Yeah.
But it means that you don't have those long stretches without anything.
Yeah.
And you can go as far back to look at like original Glaciors. Glacior?
Yeah.
Glacior.
And it's got like the Orb of Armadyl, right? And that's split into 100 bits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like at what point do you stop?
Yeah. Like the worst case is like it's got a 1 in 5,000 drop chance. So we divide it into 5,000 pieces and you're guaranteed a drop, right?
And it just becomes
and
boring.
then it's like I have to grind this boss exactly 5,000 times to get this drop. And that's bad as well. Like it's not like...
Yeah, it's a balancing point. There's definitely a happy medium to be found. And I think if you look at the scope of the game right now across all drops and all bosses, there are different options for different player types. And I think the game offers a good variety of if you want something consistent versus if you want something that has a chance to get that absolutely massive drop.
Yeah.
At the same time, when you're making new content, you need to try and hit as many different player types as possible with regard to that. And you want to make sure that, I suppose that's probably the difficult part of trying to meet both is you don't want to make something for one specific player type. If you're making like large content, like a Zami boss, can't just afford anything for one specific type.
So with Zami boss, we've tried to alleviate some of the pain that players have. Obviously introducing new high tier rewards. We don't want to just push them out because obviously that affects the rest of the economy. That affects every other boss when you're introducing like new weapons and new abilities or whatever. That's going to bring down the cost of things that are trying to compete with that. That being said, there are actions we've taken so that we attempt to not end up like Archglacior. I think that's a big pain point for players is looking at the core, you can go however many kills dry without getting one. And with that in mind, with Zami, we've actually introduced bad luck mitigation.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So going too many kills dry is going to start increasing your chance to get a rare drop. When you look at Zamorak as a boss and the amount of effort players have to put into it, the amount of time it can take to get a kill, the input costs, we thought it was very important that players didn't end up in the same headspaces that they could end up with as Archglacior.
Wow. That's I don't even know entirely how I feel about that because I was so certain prior to this that wasn't something that was going to be considered. But I think to the points that you're making, I think it makes a certain amount of sense depending on the boss and the piece of content, because I don't think bad luck mitigation needs to be everywhere.
You don't need it at Dagon Kings, right? Where you're just slaughtering thousands at a time.
No, absolutely not.
But things like Archglacior, again, where especially at high end rages where you put in a lot of effort, I think it's a good thing.
It's an interesting example of a mechanic where like there's a real balance to be had between the individual player experience. I am killing a boss, I want a drop, and the effect that it has on the economy, like how common is the drop, what is the value of it. I think we struggle a bit. My personal opinion, and there are definitely people that disagree with me on the team, is that I feel like our drops have skewed a little bit rare, and this is an example of that, where they're so rare that some people do expect to just never see one. But the problem is, if we made them more common, they'd be way less valuable.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think since I think it was ED2 was the first one really for me, where I was like, wow, if you want to complete this content, it is going to be 100 hours or whatever it may be. And then from that point on, there was a trend of uniques getting more and more rare. And I think that has changed a little bit with the Elder God Rise dungeon. I think the Elder God Rise dungeon has pushed things back a little bit where
that was
you can expect
effort,
to get a drop more frequently.
Yeah. But they're still, it's still very rare, right? Like
they absolutely
it's less
are.
rare, but still very rare.
And they've had to be adjusted a few times as well across the board because they come out and people aren't satisfied with the rates or how many hours they have to repeat the content to expect to see something.
Yeah. It was something that we took on board big with Zuck, obviously because we had the three fronts before us to kind of adjust. But that's part of the reason why Zuck's rates are kind of so free, I'd say. I think it's like 1 in 27.
It's a 1 in 17 or 1 in 18 to get something.
Exactly.
From hard mode Zuck.
Arguably, that's, in my opinion, that's still probably too rare. Obviously, there is a problem where if we brought Zuck's rates down to 1 in 5 for a drop, what is the value of them? Those
I mean,
items going to be, right?
we can see exactly what happens with that, right? Because that's basically what happened with Drygores.
Yeah.
Like what common drops means, you can study through Drygores, and like, because Drygores were vastly more available than we intended them to be, because the kills were easier and faster, and the drop rates were calibrated for much rarer kills. So effectively, it was a very generous drop rate, and it basically meant like Drygores were worth very little. It basically just handed everyone a free melee weapon. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but it essentially just handed everyone a free melee weapon. They were incredibly accessible. It killed any melee weapons lower than that, because it's not like it's hard to get up to the attack value needed to wield it, right? And then it basically, there were good aspects of that, because it made higher level PVM accessible to a larger group of players, but it also meant that like there was no profit in those drops because they were so ubiquitously ubiquitously available. It's a difficult trade-off.
It's very hard to get right.
If you want that like incredibly rare, incredibly high value drop, which is worth max cash, it can't be that common. It just can't.
And I think, and I totally agree with that. I think to what Brad said about what if like Zuck weapons were every 5 kills to get a piece. And I think to a point, to kind of surmise, as game designers, you basically, you want your player base to, you want to fire off their reward pathway and their dopamine, and you want to, give them that feel good moment. But if you give them that feel good moment every single kill, it isn't the same. It's not
going to mean anything.
You have to feel, the player needs to feel like they've worked towards something.
Yeah.
It's just alleviating that crazy grind that could have taken way, way too long. And I think that is a really strong point towards some form of bad luck protection. It's saying no one should ever have to do this boss 2,000 times without a single unique of value.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a really good rationale for why in the current state of the game, that is something that could be good.
Yeah, no,
I agree with that. You still give those players the feels good, but you're not going as far as to just give them something every kill and kill off that feeling. So no, it's been fun to work with.
So we've talked about or spoken on the economic impact of death costs and how they were a significant money sink. I think most players have a solid understanding. I think officially that's been the stance, is that they are an important money sink. But to what was said by Brad earlier, and you as well, Jack, that it's a tax on the wrong people.
Yeah.
So I think the appropriate follow-up there is, how do you tax the right people if you do need a money sink?
So we are slightly concerned that by lowering death costs, it will have an effect on inflation. Inflation will go up because less money is, regardless of our judgment of whether the correct amount of money is leaving the game from the correct people, a large amount of money is leaving the game. We've done some analysis on where the sources of money are, and death costs account for a large amount of the money that leaves the game. Our game doesn't have that many gold sinks, and death costs is a huge one. So if we massively lower death costs, we are massively lowering the gold sinks in our game. More cash is coming into the game. In fact, we're incentivizing people to do PVM by reducing death costs. So even more cash is going to come into the game as a result. So it's a double hit on inflation. So we feel like we've got to couple that with something to remove gold from the game. And so the solution that we've settled on is adding a tariff to GE trades. So every successful GE trade will essentially like destroy 1% of the gold.
1%, just 1%. Across the board, flat static. Is that for making purchases or for selling items or for both?
Let me think how it works. So it's applied to the gold that's given to the seller. Like the seller receives 1% less gold than they would otherwise have received. In practice, of course, that may mean that people just charge 1% more for things, in which case it's actually being applied to the buyer. But I think that's
directly
kind of a philosophical
it's on
distinction.
the seller. And
yes,
I mean, to me, that makes perfect sense. I think that's a good way to do it, because instead of taxing people, learning the game or PVMing, or it doesn't even matter who you're taxing or putting a penalty on. It's one specific subset of the community. And I think most players use the Grand Exchange. Almost everybody uses the Grand Exchange. And the people who are putting the most money through the Grand Exchange are the people with the most wealth. I also think, and this is, getting into what the Grand Exchange does, it is a great convenience. And if a player does not want to have to front that 1% tariff, they could opt to not use the Grand Exchange, hypothetically.
And sell it in person,
I think a 1% for, I'm going to say off the top of my head, almost every single player in the game they're going to be okay fronting that
Yep.
in order to use the grand exchange and the mass convenience you get out of it. So
honestly, it could be a lot higher and have very little impact on people's day-to-day lives. But we decided to go for 1% because it's so sort of invisible almost. Like people
Yeah.
won't notice it having even if you're trading an extremely high value item, 1% of that wealth gets taken away. You still got 99% of that wealth. It's a huge amount of gold. And I think people will just adjust to it pretty quickly.
I think off the top of my head, not having access to the numbers, as this is the first time hearing about this, I could even see that pulling more wealth out of the game significantly than what death costs were doing prior.
That's our hope. Yeah, it will have to see in practice. We anticipate that it will. We'll have to see in practice. Does it have an impact? I agree with your take that actually that's a really good price to pay for like not having to stand around trying to manually trade it, right?
Across the game, it's on everybody.
Yeah.
And that is so different from the
Yeah.
amount of players that are paying death costs. And not only paying death costs, but for many players, they feel locked to the Ring of Death, which is not, in essence, really a true gold sink. It's
Yep.
an onyx sink. It's an
Yeah.
item that is coming out of the game. It's an
Yeah.
item that's at elk value, roughly, but that's still... And related to death costs themselves, I'd be interested to see in the future, maybe we can do another one of these in a year's time and take a look at the numbers, but making players feel less restricted on the Ring of Death, you could find, even if death costs are 90% reduced, you could find a similar amount of gold leaving the game because they're actually going to be real deaths instead of players feeling forced to use the Ring of Death that's
Yes.
just pulling onyxes out.
Yeah, could be.
Something we are doing with that in mind is actually reworking the Ring of Death.
Oh, okay.
Obviously, because
It's not very useful.
it's not very useful.
Well, after these changes, it won't be.
after these changes,
Exactly. And we don't want it to feel like a crutch that players have to use. Obviously, as a pure example, say your death cost is now 3 mil. We don't want players then just going, oh, okay, I'm still going to use it because I'm saving, I don't know, 2 mil or however much. So it will be seeing a rework. To what extent currently, if there's a news post, maybe it'll be in that. But it won't have the same death saving effect. And you won't feel like you have to use it to reduce your death costs.
Okay, so it's going to be a ring that has another purpose in the game. It's
Exactly.
going to be repurposed, so it's still useful, fits into the level bracket that it
We
should
don't
be.
want it to feel like, oh, this is just trash, don't bother using it. But at the same time, we don't want it to feel like the crutch that it currently is.
Our intention with the new death costs is they're lower, significantly lower, but you can't avoid them. Like you have to pay them. So we're not intending to add in other items or effects that avoid that death cost.
First off, I'm, as someone who started a significant dialogue on death costs and the detriment that players trying to improve face across all levels and all tiers, I think this all sounds very good to me. I think these are some of the things that I was personally pushing for, and I'm pleased hearing about them discussed sort of in this capacity. And I think off the top of my head, to my understanding, these are things that will alleviate that pressure from that community that's been hit over and over and over again for many years to come. So I'm very excited about that. But I want to talk a little more about the economy and the inflation problem, purely because it's a big source of player, I would say, worry potentially, or concern, as in recent years, the value of gold has diminished. You're seeing items getting into astronomical prices. So just broad conceptually, if you could take me through how you view the inflation problem, or is it a problem even, and the reason why it's important to pull gold out of the game.
Yeah, inflation is complicated because it's a really scary word. Obviously, it's a word that comes from like real life economics, and inflation in real life is kind of scary because the price of everything goes up, and your salary doesn't necessarily increase, and now you can't afford things you could afford last year. RuneScape is interesting in the sense that when inflation goes up, the price of things goes up, but most players are making most of their money through items which they sell on the GE, which also go up in value. The value of alcohols doesn't change, but I think probably most people would agree the value of alcohols skews a little high anyway, and in fact is the source of inflation. So actually the value of alcohols goes down over time, which gradually reduces the effect that they're having on inflation over time. But in a sense, your earning potential and your spending requirements kind of increase roughly in parity with each other. So inflation doesn't work quite the same way in RuneScape as it does in real life. That said, there's one particularly obvious problem with inflation in RuneScape, which is that a while ago now we hit the gold cap value on the GE, and certain items simply can't be traded, which frankly is a bit ridiculous. So with the update where the GE tax is being applied, we're also going to be lifting that restriction on the GE. So you'll be able to trade items above max cash on the GE. There's some wizardry going on at the back end of the engine. From a player point of view, it should just look transparently like you can put in a value larger than 2 bill.
Is there any cap on that? Or is it
There is a
supposed to
theoretical
be-
cap. You're not going to hit that cap. It's 2 billion times 2 billion. So you're not going to.
Wow.
Wait, is that
So-
correct? Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
it will
Yeah,
be,
it's
yeah.
2 billion
So-
times 2 billion.
2.147 times 2.147.
So no item will ever eclipse that.
I mean,
Or
never say never. We
Well,
might
We
put
could have a
crazy
video of
algorithms in
you
the game.
saying that
No,
now,
I would.
and it's like, look at the price.
It will be
to X
hard for
It'd
the
be
game
very
to
difficult for
ever
the-
reach. Someone
it's
will need
in-
to sit down and work out, like, if we increase inflation by 100% every year, it will take
How many years?
2 million years to reach that cap or something. It's unlikely
It's
to ever
like,
reach that
it's an
cap. Yeah.
astronomically large number.
Yeah.
That
Will
is-
also be the money pouch will also go up to that value as well.
That's fantastic.
But coin stacks won't change because we're not changing the underlying way that coin stacks work.
It's kind of like a way of dodging the cap.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
in your coin pouch, there's something in the system behind the scenes happening to avoid the cap. But as a player, you'll just see your money pouch goes higher.
Exciting.
So yeah, your money pouch will
Wow.
increase to effectively an infinite value. Like, it's not actually infinite, but it's larger
It
than I
may
think
as
you
well
could
be.
realistically reach. Yeah.
I'm blown away by that. And I think that's a very significant change. I think
Yeah.
the max cash stack has been, an iconic thing for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
But to your point, with the value of GP getting lower and items going above max cash, it creates a significant problem. It becomes
Yeah.
difficult to buy and sell items.
Yeah.
It also becomes difficult to get a fair price on items or know the
Yeah.
value of items. So I mean, my suspicion is that will help a lot of people. I think
Yeah.
personally that's large. Do you look at like merchers or merchanting as something that might be impacted by this, or rather something that maybe needed to be balanced around?
I guess it's worth distinguishing between, like,
I suppose
trade in what you could consider essential items like FSOA, where, like, it's a part of the game. Like, it's like we drop rare drops from
they
bosses.
come into the game.
They're expected to be
used,
traded.
They have a
exactly.
value.
They're part of the gameplay of the game, which is a little different from the discontinued rares market, which is kind of its own kind of bubble. So we're treating those as two separate problems. So it's very important that we enable trade in rare but important gameplay items, because it's if I can't get the value out of a boss kill because of the way the system works, that's a bit ridiculous. We need to fix that. Looking at party hats is a slightly separate problem. Obviously, they will be tradable on the GE as well, but because the supply and the number of them is so low, and the price of them has become so inflated, we're going to be looking at them in particular and deciding what to do about them as a separate problem from, like, rare boss drops.
Okay.
So I don't want to, like, every time we talk about the economy, it wreaks havoc on the economy,
Yes,
right? So I'm
absolutely,
very
yeah.
wary of saying anything in particular
Oh,
at this stage.
absolutely.
But those are two separate problems, and we do want to look at them. My personal take would be that I think it's kind of dropped off now. But around the time I started looking into RuneScape, so I was new to RuneScape 12 years ago, party hats were an important aspiration for people. Like, they were a part of the game's ecosystem. I'm going to save up to buy a party hat. And I think that's died off in part because party hats are just kind of a playground for merchants instead.
Yes.
They're no longer an aspirational thing because you can't afford them. They go up in price faster than you can possibly earn gold.
You couldn't get one by playing the game.
Exactly,
Predominantly, unless you did something
And
absolutely
that
nuts.
feels like something has gone from RuneScape to me there. That's my personal take. I'm kind of not happy about where it is. I don't think we need a plaything
It
for
feels
merchants.
too unattainable.
Yeah, exactly.
And it feels like there's just a subset of players that are just going around themselves, and the price is going up. But there's no real trade happening because it's just in a finite loop.
Yeah.
And they just control the market, so they're kind of just doing.
And that's
what they
not like, I don't want to be too cynical about it, but, like, it's not doing us any good. It's not doing players any good. If
No,
you aspire to
absolutely.
buy a party hat, that's
you
rubbish.
can't.
You can't.
Or if you do, you're paying an astronomical amount that doesn't feel
which
fair.
is essentially an imaginary made-up number.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I want to make clear that, like, addressing discontinued rares is its own very specific, very highly sensitive problem that we
Is
can't
separate
just
from
apply
this.
a flat
Yes.
solution to based on regular trading.
I think a natural follow-up to that is, although unintended in this GE tariff and update of going above max cash, do you think it will have an impact on the rare market, or is that a potential positive that could come out of this?
If we don't change anything else, I think with the way that they're currently traded and the control over the market of them, I find it unlikely that people will be in a hurry to list them on the GE.
Okay.
So it probably won't affect, if we don't do anything else, I think it probably won't have much impact on them.
Okay.
The ability to trade some items doesn't necessarily mean that people will trade them.
And I suppose that's significantly less important than focusing on an item like the Fractured Staff of Armadyl. If that's above max cash and people can't use the Grand Exchange to sell pieces of it,
Exactly.
that is significantly more problematic because it's a core part of the game.
Yeah,
And now
exactly.
anyone who wants this highly useful, highly sought after item now has to stand where we are, World 2 Grand Exchange, and type over and over and over again and not know if you're getting a fair price and all the rest.
Yeah.
RuneScape is, unless you're playing Ironman, RuneScape is a game about economics.
Yes.
But I feel like a lot of players don't think of it as a game about economics and don't necessarily...
They're interacting in that way. They don't recognize
that's
what they're doing.
Yeah. So one of the early things I was fascinated by was how change averse RuneScape and RuneScape's community fascinate me because it's an extremely change averse community. I mean, you can see that very strongly in old school, but even in RS3, it's still a thing. And yet RuneScape is like the most frequently updated game, even though our update rate is lower than it used to be. It's still extremely frequently updated. But our players kind of don't want anything to change. And I feel like inflation is part of that. That like the idea that items fluctuate in value over time disturbs people. The idea that like they see the items in their bank as an investment, and if the value of them drops, that's us stealing money from them. But we can't, we genuinely like, so prior to Timbo taking over as balancer, our balance philosophy was very much, we must maintain the value of things at all time. And I don't think we can maintain that philosophy. We couldn't maintain that philosophy. Like it wasn't possible to have the game constantly changing, but the economy never changed. The value of items, of course, fluctuates over time. There's nothing we can do about that. The fact that Dragon is now at ALC value isn't an avoidable problem. Of course it's at ALC value. It can't not be.
It would take a lot to make it not be ALC value. And
so if you log in with your 10-year-old account and you're like, oh, sweet, is all my rune armor still really valuable?
Probably
like,
not.
No, not really.
Better stuff, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I suppose is sort of where that's going.
At the same time, there's going to be some flips where a player's going to log in and they're going to have
magic compos that are fortunate
ring,
components,
right? And that's now going to be 10 mil when they bought it was a few 100K, right?
Yeah.
It's just the nature of the game.
It's always going to be very fluid. With relation to the Grand Exchange price, I'm going to bring that back to death costs very quickly. One of the major gripes about death costs, especially for Ironman players, is Ironmen don't actively participate in the economy the way that a main account does.
Yeah.
And yet they are taxed for dying based on the current market trend value of an attributed item. So for example, a seismic set, which are tier 90 Wand Orb from Virago, used to be 200 million coins. Carapac comes out, releases some upgrades, Greater Concentrated Blast. Now a seismic set is over 1 billion coins. So those Ironmen that have had seismics for 5 years are now paying 5x on an item that they have had for a very, very long time. And that is an aspect that I know for a number of members of that community, that's a pretty significant kind of pain point for death costs. So is the hope with this death cost change that it's just going to be low enough that it doesn't matter what the GE price is, it's still going to be manageable and reasonable? Or do you see that as something that could come up again as a problem in the future?
I mean, if we assume that the price of things will continue to rise over time, which I think is a reasonable assumption, there's no way that it could potentially rise to become problematic again. It's an interesting problem because obviously the philosophy of Ironman, there are two philosophies that go into Ironman. One is you do everything yourself. You cannot affect nor be affected by other players. But also, contrarily, we don't build an Ironman specific game. That example you've just given is a really interesting example of a conflict between those, because I would say at a philosophical level, the GE price of things shouldn't matter to you as an Ironman, right? But it does through that mechanic. That suggests to me that it should work differently.
It's interesting because Ironmen are naturally affected by the economy, though, because when we release content, the drop tables are done in a way to match the economy.
Yeah,
the economy is going up. You're getting more gold from drops. They're naturally being affected.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
An Ironman now doing say ED3 obviously injects a lot of money versus an Ironman, say 5 to 10 years ago, that was doing Cowfight King. The amount of money they're receiving from doing PVM is completely different.
Yeah.
With ED3 now granting them more money than ever, it kind of makes sense that the def cost relates to the current economy in that way, because the content relates to the current economy.
Although it's interesting because it's basically expressed entirely through the inflation on alcohols.
Yes.
Like alcohols inflate in a different way, that we manually set alcohol drops or alcohol drops.
Of how many and the quantity that come into the game.
Depending on our judgment of where inflation is roughly. So Ironmen see the benefit of that. They don't see the natural benefit of inflation increasing the value of drops. I think you're still correct. It's just there's a slight disconnect.
The alternative would be like, okay, you have a fixed def cost value, say for a seismic wand of, I don't know, 500k, but then say the GE value of seismic wand itself goes down to 2 mil.
Yeah.
Are Ironmen going to feel like they're being screwed because they're paying 500k for something normal players are paying 20k for?
Yeah.
I think what you'd have to do is you'd have to set it in such a way that, whether it's from the point that it's sort of arbitrary, but from the point that Ironman got that item, the def cost would never go up from that point.
The practical implementation of it would have to be just a fixed value.
Yeah.
We'd have to set a fixed value for every item, and that's what Ironmen pay instead of.
You'd assume you do it just based on like the
coin value,
the weapon tier, or
yeah, and
so,
there were proposals for def costs that were related to the tier of your gear that you had on. I think a lot of those stem from that. Also fixes the Ironman problem, although it probably in functionality it works imperfectly for a bunch of other reasons, because not all tier 92s or tier 95s are created equal.
Yeah.
So I think it opens up a slew of other issues, but that was just one of the main.
I think I would say that the plan changes to def costs anyway will largely resolve that problem in the short term, in the sense that a massive reduction in def costs benefits everybody. It may be that it becomes a problem again in the future. I think what you said about like we will inevitably see more inflation. We will inevitably see a rise in alcohols. Sorry. It will always be possible for Ironmen to make more money in the future. It's likely to remain sane for quite a long time to come. There's a separate sort of like, how would it work ideally, separate from like, is this good enough? And I think it's probably good enough. And actually doing the ideal solution would involve going in and like manually setting the alc prices.
A lot of things,
yeah, it would have to be based on the vendor value, I guess, and then
that changes the alc value.
But we don't pay too much attention to the like the alc value of rare items isn't super important, so we don't pay too much attention to it. Suddenly we'd have to be razor focusing on the alc value of all items.
Value of an FSOA, something that no one's going out.
Exactly,
like,
and suddenly that would matter. And we'd have to do that for hundreds or thousands or more items to fix that problem. I think the rough solution that just about fixes it probably fine.
Perfect world, absolutely, but feasibly, what you have done or what has been done should fix the same problem just by dramatically reducing them so much that you're not looking at an item with a super high reclaim cost per se. Here's a question, maybe a little technical, possibly a Brad question if you've touched on this. Certain items to sort of work around death costs are released with arbitrary reclaim values. For example, one of the two Lang swords, the main hand, I believe, has an arbitrary value. The offhand is tied to the GE price. So one is more expensive than the other. Same thing applies with dyed items. So a Saren Godbow is worth 2 bill and a Barrows dyed Saren Godbow is worth 400 mil in terms of the reclaim cost. So with regard to those items, are they going to be retied to the GE, or are they going to just stay as they are, they haven't been touched?
There's a problem there, firstly, with consistency.
Yes.
Obviously, it is a bug that some of these have made it through the cracks with values that aren't equal. Whilst I kind of like the idea of a purchasable item like a die that reduces the def cost of that value. I personally like the idea. It's like you're investing so you don't pay later. It's weird, but no, these things should be consistent. I'm not sure exactly what the plan is for the updated def cost system. I believe it will be using the GE value so that it's just consistent across the board.
That seems good.
I think that is the ideal. But in the short term, even before that, these inconsistencies should be flattened out.
Yeah, we should just treat them as bugs.
Yeah, they are just bugs. It is literally, there is a parameter you put on an object and it's just been missed on.
I mean, I agree with you that there's an interesting reward space there. It's potentially dangerous because we're talking about gold sinks, right?
Yeah.
And like the more that we reduce gold sinks, the more that we contribute to inflation. That's kind of the philosophy behind the way Trim Masterwork works. Although it doesn't affect the death costs, it affects the degrade because it doesn't degrade on task if it's trimmed. The idea is that by making it sorry, it's not trimmed, it's customized. When you customize it, it no longer degrades on task, which has effectively sunk the item out of the economy in exchange for reduced degrade cost. I feel like there's a trade-off and interesting design space to explore there as and when we want to, because obviously like items being tradable
means they can come back into the economy.
Means that they're not being sunk out of the economy. If you could, I mean, I think we probably wouldn't just implement customize the item. It's now untradeable, but you don't pay death costs on it. I have a feeling that would be a net negative on the economy rather than a net positive. But it's the kind of thing that we could explore.
But there's a space there that could be played around.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. That would be an interesting one. That would be an interesting one because that would solve the problem for Ironman. I'm not saying that we should implement exactly what I just said.
Yeah, of course.
But thinking about it
hypothetically, yeah.
This is how we go through design, right? What would the hypothetical impact be of the design that we're outlining? If we implemented that, it would actually fix the Ironman problem because Ironman would have no problem customizing their items because they have no reason to trade them. So if that then made them immune to death costs, that's a great example of a win-win. Exactly.
If they want to seek out and spend the time getting a die from a clue scroll to put on an item, give them a tangible benefit.
I'm going to write that
It's going on the notepad.
I'm intrigued about the potential of that.
Very cool.
I think we probably shouldn't do it, but I'll see if we can
it's
explore
an idea.
it.
Worth investigating.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I feel like it raises the topic
Of inflation more generally, that I think we've been talking about, inflation isn't as bad as in real life, but it's not something that we want. We wouldn't want inflation to just accelerate like crazy. Even just the sheer incomprehensibility of the numbers, I think, is a bad thing, right? When you're putting in this time next year when you're paying 20 billion gold for something, and you're just like, this is just meaningless numbers. It stops being interesting.
It's jarring for the player base as well already. I know. I mean, RuneScape gets a lot of lapsed players. They come back.
Yeah, exactly.
And I have players coming back from 2 years ago saying, "Hey, what's the best PVM gear? Don't worry about the budget." And then I stop and I say, I have a feeling we're going to have to worry about the budget. And they'll say, no, you don't. I have 6 bill. And you can get half of one combat style with that, all the way maxed out.
Yeah.
And that is extremely, different from, if you go back 5, 6, 7 years, you could get best in slot for, I don't know, it's in the hundreds of mils. And that's changed. So it's definitely jarring.
Yeah.
Is that one of the primary driving forces for wanting to reduce this inflation if it's not inherently bad for the game?
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Like, with an engaged player who's buying and selling, inflation doesn't have that much effect. But that's an example of a case where it really does have an impact. The value of the gold in your bank drops over time. In theory, the value of the items in your bank increases over time, but that depends on whether or not they're still relevant to the economy. Some items become irrelevant, and the value drops, or they get dropped by Archglazer, and the value drops, right? So we can't protect your bank in that regard. So the reason I bring this up is I don't want to create the impression that we just don't care about inflation. It is bad. It's just not life.
It's not as bad as it would be in real life if it was happening to the same degree.
Yeah. You're not going to lose your house as a result, right?
Yes, hopefully.
So the reason I want to bring that up is it's a delicate balance. Like we could kill inflation overnight. We could just remove all alcohols from drop tables. Easy. And that's that is the overwhelming majority of the gold that comes into the game comes from alcohols in PVM. I think I talked about this recently about saying stone spirits were an experiment in how we could address that. We removed rune, but we put salvage on, basically 1-to-1 in order to make sure that people weren't losing money. I don't think people would want us to fix inflation by removing all alcohols from the game, right? Because then you're not getting any gold.
Something, right?
Exactly. Well, all of everything else on the drop tables just became more common by default. Or we have to put more skilling supplies on, or we have to put more finished goods on, which just reduces the value of skills. There are levers that we can pull, but most of them do damage by pulling them. And that makes the problem very difficult to fix. The other obvious one we can do is add more sinks to the game. So we talked about a 1% GE tariff. We could make that 20%, 50%. and that would cut inflation down, right? Because we'd be absolutely
To a point,
money would
yeah.
be pouring out of the game. Yeah, 50% people wouldn't bother
I just
sell things
yeah.
anymore. But yeah, that we could make that value significantly higher, and that would also suck money out of the game, and it would reduce inflation. And again, I don't think players would want us to ship a 20% GE tariff. That would be a serious disincentive to trade, which would be a disincentive to the value of items, which would make people feel bad when they're playing PVM and
Yeah.
they get drops that aren't worth anything and they don't feel like they can sell.
It would be it'd make the experience a lot less fun. And
Yeah.
I think, I'm sure there were discussions internal, 5%, 2%, 1%, 3%, what's the right amount? And I think 1% is probably right on the money, because anything past that, and there's a chance that there's a certain subset of player that will be unhappy selling an item and getting less back for it. I think 1% is fairly reasonable. I think the majority of players, you chuck it in at -5 anyway, because you want to sell it for whatever the highest price is. And I don't personally think, and this is my stance in the community, that people are going to be too upset with a 1%. I think, and there might be some who are upset because a 1% decrease to PVM profit or any kind of profit, to a certain subset of player, that can be a pretty significant negative. But I think most are going to happily roll with it and know that the burden of the economy is no longer on just people trying to learn.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, be a much healthier place. Yeah.
Well, that is all the time we have. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you in the next one.